Hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on sensations, as well as touching a little bit on psychophysics. We'll be diving into the fascinating world of how our senses work and how they interact with stimuli around us. It's amazing, really, to think about how our brains take in information. How the world around us is recognized by our senses, allowing us to experience everything from the taste of our favorite food to the beauty of a sunset. Sensation and perception work seamlessly together to allow us to detect both the presence of and changes in the stimuli around us. Understanding this process is exceedingly important for our everyday lives, as the knowledge generated by psychologists is used in so many ways to help so many people. So in our lecture today, we will focus primarily on sensation, but we cannot ignore the fact that sensation and perception go hand in hand. So we will touch on both topics in this lecture and in the next one, where we'll try to focus more on perception. We will explore in this lecture how each sense accomplishes the basic process of transduction in different but in related ways. We will also be discussing psychophysics, which is the branch of psychology that studies the effects of physical stimuli on sensory perceptions. Psychophysicists study the absolute threshold of sensation, as well as the difference threshold, or just noticeable difference, the JND. Weber's law maintains that the JND of a stimulus is a constant proportion of the original intensity of the stimulus. So, get ready to learn about how our senses detect stimuli and how our brains process that information. We'll be discussing the eye, the ear, taste, smell, touch, and even the vestibular system. So let's dive in. So we'll begin by discussing the fascinating topic that touches really at the very essence of our understanding of the world around us as far as sensory thresholds. So our senses are remarkable, and they allow us really to experience the world around us. However, have you ever wondered how much of the sensory information that exists in our environment actually reaches our awareness? So sensory thresholds help us to understand just that. So a sensory threshold refers to the minimum amount of sensory stimulation required for an individual to detect a particular stimulus. Now, each of our senses has a unique threshold, and this threshold varies from person to person. These thresholds can be influenced by a variety of factors, including age, genetics, and environmental factors. The concept of sensory thresholds is important because it helps us to understand how much of the world we experience through our senses. For example, consider our sense of hearing. The lowest sound that we can hear is called the threshold of hearing, and it is typically around 0 decibels. However, in a noisy environment such as a concert or a busy street, we may need a sound to be much louder than the threshold of hearing in order for us to detect it. And this is because the noise in the environment can mask the sound that we are trying to hear. Similarly, consider our sense of touch. The threshold for detecting pressure on the skin is much lower than the threshold for detecting a pinprick. If we feel pressure on our skin with a force of about 0.4 grams, whereas we need a force of about 5 grams to feel a pinprick. These thresholds help us understand why we can feel the weight of a feather on our skin, but we do not feel a tiny insect crawling on us. Other important aspects of sensory threshold would be their role in sensory adaptation. Our sensory systems are designed to adapt to constant or repetitive stimulation, which means that we may become less sensitive to a stimulus over time. For example, if you live on a busy road, you may become less sensitive to the noise of traffic as your brain adapts to that constant sound. And this is why we may not notice the sound of our own breathing or the feeling of our own clothes on our skin after a while. So overall, sensory thresholds really do play a crucial role in how we experience the world around us. They help us understand the minimum amount of sensory stimulation required for us to detect a stimulus and how our sensitivity to stimuli can change over time. So let's go on now and discuss a little bit about psychophysics. This is a field of psychology that really investigates the relationship between physical stimuli and sensory perceptions. So psychophysics aims to determine the limits of human sensation, including the ability to detect very faint stimuli. The concept of an absolute threshold is central to psychophysics. The absolute threshold is defined as the lowest intensity of a stimulus that an organ can detect with 50% accuracy. So Gustav Fechner, a German psychologist, was the first to study the relationship between the strength of a stimulus and a person's ability to detect it. And his pioneering work laid the foundation for the field of psychophysics. In a typical psychophysics experiment, an individual is presented with a series of trials in which a signal is sometimes presented and sometimes not, or in which two stimuli are presented that are either the same or different. For example, in a hearing test, an individual may be asked to indicate whether they heard a faint sound or not. Because the faint signals can create uncertainty, the individual may sometimes think they heard a sound when none was there, or fail to detect a sound when one was there. Signal detection analysis is a technique used to analyze the responses of an individual in a psychophysics experiment. It really aims to determine the ability of the individual to separate true signals from background noise. In signal detection analysis, each judgment trial creates 4 possible outcomes: a hit, a false alarm, a miss, or a correct rejection. A hit occurs when the individual correctly says yes when there was a sound. A false alarm occurs when the individual responds yes to no signal. A miss occurs when the individual responds no when there was a signal. And a correct rejection occurs when the individual responds no when there was no signal. So overall, in summary, psychophysics is part of our study of sensation. It's that field of psychology that studies the effects of physical stimuli on sensory perceptions and mental states. The absolute threshold is the lowest intensity of a stimulus that an organism can detect with 50% accuracy. And psychophysics often uses signal detection analysis to determine an individual's ability to detect signals in background noise. And a final criteria we will discuss in psychophysics is known as sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation refers to a decline in sensitivity to a constant stimulus. And this process can be seen in many different sensory systems, including vision, hearing, and touch. For example, if you go into a dark movie theater, your eyes will eventually adapt to the low light levels, and you will be able to see much better. However, if you then leave the theater and go outside into the bright sunlight, you will be temporarily blinded because your eyes have adapted to the low light levels. Another example of sensory adaptation occurs in the sense of touch. If you hold a heavy object for a long time, you will eventually stop feeling the weight of the object. And this is because the nerve cells in your hands that respond to pressure and touch become less responsive over time. Similarly, if you wear a ring on your finger for a long time, you will eventually stop feeling the pressure of the ring against your skin. So sensory adaptation is an important process because it allows our sensory system to focus on new or changing stimuli. If we were constantly bombarded by the same stimuli, we would eventually become overwhelmed and unable to process new information. And so sensory adaptation also helps to conserve energy by reducing the amount of neural activity that is required to process a constant stimuli. So in conclusion, psychophysics is a field of study that seeks to understand the relationship between physical stimuli and the psychological experiences they create. The absolute threshold refers to the minimum amount of stimulation that is needed for a stimulus to be detected, while the difference threshold, or JND, the just notable difference, refers to the smallest change in a stimulus that can be detected. Sensory adaptation refers to a decline in sensitivity to a constant stimulus. By understanding these concepts, researchers can better understand how we apprehend the world around us and how our experiences are shaped by the physical environment. Now, the final idea that I want to kind of look at is an interesting thing known as blind sight. And here's where you get into the idea of that weird place between sensation and perception. It's a fascinating phenomenon in which people are unable to consciously report a visual stimuli, yet are able to accurately answer questions about what they are seeing. Blind sight provides compelling evidence that our brains can process information outside of our awareness, and that our conscious experience of the world is only a small part of the total cognitive processing that occurs in our brains. Blind sight occurs when certain areas of the visual cortex are damaged, typically due to stroke, tumor, or other types of brain injury. As a result of this damage, people with blind sight are unable to consciously perceive visual stimuli and report that they cannot see anything when asked directly about the stimuli. However, when they are asked more indirect questions, they are able to give correct answers. For example, people with blind sight are able to correctly determine an object's location and direction of movement. as well as identify simple geometrical forms and patterns. One of the earliest and most famous cases of blind sight was reported by the British neurologist Lawrence Weisskranz in the 1970s. And Weisskranz studied a patient named DB who had suffered a stroke that damaged his visual cortex, causing him to lose the ability to see objects in the left half of his visual field. When DB was asked to guess the location of an object that was shown to him in his blind spot, he guessed randomly and reported that he could not see anything. However, when he was asked to reach out and touch the object, he was able to do so with surprising accuracy, even though he still claimed that he could not see the object. This led Weisskranz to conclude that DB had a form of unconscious perception that he called blind sight. DB's ability to accurately reach for the object in his blind field suggests that he was processing visual information in his brain outside of his conscious awareness, and that this information was being used to guide his actions. Since then, many other cases of blind sight have been reported, and researchers have used a variety of techniques to study this phenomenon in more detail. For example, brain image studies have shown that even in people with blind sight, there is still activity in the visual cortex when they are presented with visual stimuli in their blind field. This suggests that the brain is still processing visual information even though the person is not consciously aware of it. One interesting aspect of blind sight is that it seems to be largely restricted to certain types of visual processing. For example, people with blind sight are able to detect the presence and direction of movement of objects in their blind field, but they are not able to identify the shape or color of those objects. And this suggests that different types of visual processing may be subserved by different parts of the visual cortex, and that blind sight is the result of damage to very specific areas that are responsible for the conscious perception of certain visual features. And so that is showing us a little bit of the difference between sensation and perception within the visual cortex. Blind sight has also been had some important implications for our understanding of consciousness and the nature of the mind. It suggests that our conscious experience of the world is not the whole story, that there is a wealth of information processing that occurs outside of our awareness. And this raises important philosophical questions about the nature of the mind and the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Overall, blind sight, I think, is a fascinating phenomenon that provides important insights into the nature of perception and consciousness, as well as sensation and how it connects with the brain processing. Although people with blind sight are unable to consciously perceive visual stimuli, they are still able to accurately answer questions about what they are seeing, suggesting that there is still a parallel and implicit process at work in their minds. Blind sight challenges our understanding of consciousness and the limits of our awareness, and highlights the complexity and richness of the human mind. So, as we close out this lecture, I want to just highlight that sensation is the process by which sensory receptors and the nervous system detect and respond to stimuli in the environment, resulting in the experience of sensory perception. It is the first step in that process that moves towards perception, and it provides raw sensory information that is further processed and then interpreted by the brain. Perception, on the other hand, involves the brain's interpretation of sensory information to give meaning to the environment. Perception is an active process that involves the combination of top-down processing, which involves the use of prior knowledge and expectations to interpret incoming sensory information, and bottom-up processing, which involves the analysis of sensory information, starting at the sensory receptors and working up to the brain. So there are several key differences between sensation and perception. First, sensation is a passive process, while perception is an active process. Sensation simply involves the detection of sensory stimuli, while perception involves the interpretation of those stimuli. Secondly, sensation is based on physical stimuli, while perception is influenced by a great variety of factors, including culture, context, and expectation. Finally, sensation is relatively stable and constant across individuals, while perception can vary greatly from person to person. An example of the difference between sensation and perception can be seen in the phenomenon of optical illusions. Optical illusions are visual stimuli that create the perception of something that is not actually there, or distort the perception of something that is. For example, the Mueller-Lyer illusion is a classical optical illusion in which two lines of equal length appear to be different lengths due to the presence of arrows on the ends of the lines. The sensation of the two lines is the same, but the perception of their length is influenced by the arrows. Another example of the difference between sensation and perception is the effect of context on perception. The same sensory stimulus can be perceived differently depending on the context in which it is presented. For example, a person standing in a noisy environment may perceive a sound as louder than a person standing in a quiet environment, even though the physical intensity of the sound is the same in both situations. So in conclusion, sensation and perception are two closely related processes that work together to give us our experience of the world around us. Sensation provides the raw sensory information, while perception interprets that information and gives it meaning. Although they are closely related, there are some important differences between the two processes, and understanding those differences is essential to understanding how we experience the world. And so in our next lecture, we will take some time and look more closely at the perception side of this sensation-perception connection. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. You take care. Bye-bye.